Okay, again, if you're just joining us, we're here at V-A-C Zattere in Venice, Italy, as part of the ongoing exhibition Non-Extractive Architecture on Designing Without Depletion. We're really happy to have Julia Watson joining us today as part of the ongoing lecture series. Okay. I'm going to just read your bio. Designer, activist, and academic and author, Julia Watson is a leading expert in the field of Lo-TEK, nature-based technologies for the built environment and climate-resilient design. Her best-selling book with Taschen, Lo-TEK Design by Radical Indigenism, has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, Monocle, Architectural Digest, and more. Regularly teaching at Harvard and Columbia University, Julia's studio work involves landscape and urban design, along with public speaking and consulting with brands on sustainability. In her studio, she collaborates with horticulturist as Watson Salembier with a focus on rewilding, and has just completed the summer gardens for Rockefeller Center using a native plant palette inspired by the American meadow. Thank you so much, Julia, for joining us, and I'll now hand over the reins to you.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to somehow be here in Venice. We've wanted this to happen for such a long time, and it's finally here. And so congrats to all you guys for doing this and organizing this. I'm going to share my screen now, and I'll start the lecture. Okay. You guys can see that? You guys can see the screen?
Yes, sorry. We were
okay.
Yeah, we can see.
Perfect. So I just wanted to open today just by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the first people of Brooklyn, New York, who are the Lenape people, both past and present. And I wanted to honor with gratitude both the Lenape people and their land. And I wanted to start today by talking about myth, which is a word that's taken from the ancient Greek, mythos, and it means the story of the people, and it's really guided mankind for millennia. And so what I read about in the book is this idea of the mythology of technology. So 300 years ago, the intellectuals of the European Enlightenment, they constructed what we know as the mythology of our current day technology. And it was influenced by this confluence of humanism, colonialism, and imperialism. And I show this map on the screen because it really, typifies the ideology of the day, this imperialism of the aristocracy you can see sort of across the top in these bucolic landscapes, and the colonialism of the globe that is being territorialized, and then this sort of European industrialization of the innovations of the day down the bottom. And so it was really this type of thinking and this mythology that ignored local wisdom and all the indigenous innovations that were available at this time, deeming them primitive. And so favoring fuel by fire, this mythology feasted on the felling of forests and the extraction of resources. And it powered the age of industrialization, which at the same time it distanced us from nature. And really today, this is the legacy that still haunts us. And so over the past few hundred years, under this influence of Western culture, only a sliver of all the technologies that were available to us at that time that existed on Earth during the Enlightenment were valued and then shepherded through to the present. And only until recently, the mythology of modern societies has been really focused on conquering nature in the name of progress. However, slowly, we're seeing this mythology start to change. And rather than viewing humankind as superior to nature, there's been a shift. And it appears that this superiority complex that we've had has been superseded now by the savior complex. And with this shift, one of the most prominent movements has been the conservation movement. And that itself has actually displaced millions of indigenous people and their technologies. And it's now come to rebrand itself as the climate change solution. And in the process, it's pocketed $1 billion worth of funding. However, we're still confronted by these climate events that we can't predict, that are increasing in force and ferocity and how often they're occurring, and then species extinctions that the conservation movement has really not prevented, and as well as ecosystems failures that we really seem to not be able to stop. And so what I see as humanity's real challenge will not be to save nature, but it's going to be to learn to work with her wildness and those wildness and wildernesses that remain, and to rewild the civilizations that we construct today and in the future. And so responding to these challenges, this is where sort of LoTEK positions itself as a movement that considers local technologies and communities as an evolutionary extension of life that works not as superior, not as a savior, but in symbiosis with nature. And it does this by really deeply considering whether some of our most sustainable innovations are actually rooted in cultures and technologies that were figured out a millennia ago. And so while scientists, they've acknowledged that we're in the midst of this sixth great extinction, what they haven't really acknowledged is that species extinction alone, I don't think is going to be the 21st century's greatest loss. What I think might be the 21st century's greatest loss and legacy that we'll remember is the loss of these technologies, which are endangered as much as local as species, yet they're not even recognized as technologies that may hold a key to humanity's survival. And so these are the technologies that have been evolved and passed down through generations, and they've been evolved in response to climate extremes like flooding and fire and drought and sea level rise and severe weather events, food, water insecurity. They're all the same crises that we're experiencing today, and they're incredibly well adapted to their environments. And in fact, these technologies, plot twist, they play a key role in conserving global biodiversity. And so these are the technologies that are featured in LoTEK. And if you're not familiar with the word LoTEK, it's because I made that word up. It is a combination derived from two words, local and traditional ecological technology, or TEK. And the title is meant as a provocation towards our inherited biases of towards local cultures and their technologies. But it's also because ignorantly we keep on referring to these types of technologies as LoTEK, LOWTECH, and that's often talked about as unsophisticated or primitive, or even, born within this idea of industrialization, which is not what these technologies are. They're neither primitive nor unsophisticated. They're incredibly sophisticated and incredibly sustainable, and they embody all of today's sustainability principles like low embodied energy, low impact, low cost, and they often form these closed loop systems. They have multi-scalar impacts and multiplier effects across various different scales. And they're just incredibly interesting and complex systems to work with. So they are also derived from what I mentioned before, TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge. And this is knowledge that has been universally ignored by the scientific community. And it's the foundational knowledge of this book. And it's defined really broadly as the cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. And so I just want to say that once again, because I just find this so fascinating, that a technology is really framed by knowledge about environment, practices that happen around that technology, and a belief system that that technology is couched within. So if we want to actually sort of visualize what traditional ecological knowledge is and couch it within somewhat of a Western scientific framework, we can think of it as a system of nested concepts that explain the construction of the world around an individual, around us. And at the top of a pyramid, if we want to look at it as a pyramid, is the individual. And beneath that is the individual's understanding of their local lands and animals, their local ecosystems. And then underneath that sits the land and management resource systems, the practices that individual practices to manage their ecosystems. And then beneath that is their social institutions, and then underneath that is their worldview or belief systems. And so now going to the sort of the subtitle of the book, which is Designed by Radical Indigenism. This is not something I made up. It's a philosophy by a professor, Eva Marie Garut, who's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And she talks about this rebuilding of knowledge through explorations of indigenous philosophies that are capable of generating new dialogues. But she talks about it in the framework of new dialogues for indigenous communities going and looking at their philosophies and sort of rebuilding new understandings and calling and talking about that within the context of climate change and resilience. And through my work, through my design work for the last 20 years, working with Indigenous communities, I came across these concepts, and also teaching high tech and in the built environment, really started to see these parallels and applications in design and sustainability. So Designed by Radical Indigenism was really arguing for an extension of this concept into the idea of the built environment, and to look at local knowledge and technologies to inform our thinking about local sustainability and resilience. And so LoTEK, it began as, I would say, an obsession. It transformed into a book, but really the vision was for a movement to rebuild an understanding of local knowledge and technology and vernacular design to generate sustainable, climate resilient infrastructures. And, at this moment, I think we're in a really interesting time. We seem to be obsessed with high tech and smart cities, but we're also seem to be in a moment in the last year of massive reflection. And we can either continue this narrow view of technology, which we have, and that has distanced us from nature, but we've already called for that idea to really be reinvestigated, to somehow synthesize with nature or create a symbiosis. And at this point, we can acknowledge that the mythology of technology that we currently have, even within our profession, is just one way and not the only way for humans to live and to design with natural systems and in response to climate change. And so thinking resiliently, the most effective way to mitigate climate change is really to recognize that a solution that is embedded in a community and their environment is an incredibly effective way to form resilience at scale. And so I wanted to go through one example of that, and that example is from the book, and it's located in India, and it's called the Berry Wastewater Aquaculture System of the Bengalese people, of a very small community of Bengalese people who are multi-generational fishermen. So in parts of the world where rivers are often left contaminated with sewage, there is one Indian city that has 15 million people that uses its floodplains to treat its wastewater. And it does this through this amazing combination of sunshine and sewage and the symbiosis between algae and bacteria. And through this process, the wastewater that comes in about 95% water, but about 5% raw sewage, it is broken down. And this happens by traveling through a system of ponds. Firstly, a system of settling ponds where large particles are settled in these large ponds, and then the water then continues through to these series of fish ponds, and this whole process happens in about 30 days. And there's these really interesting indicators as to when water should be transferred from the settling ponds into this fish ponds, and it's through color. So when the water actually changes color from like a murky brown to a green, understanding that the process of cleaning has actually occurred, that's when the farmers know that they should sort of start to transfer the water into their fish ponds. And then the water goes into the fish ponds, feeds their fish. The water is removed from the fish ponds to irrigate farms, to irrigate rice and vegetables, and then it continues on to actually move into another river system and downstream. So this whole process, as I said, it takes 30 days for this water cleaning system to occur. It was started about 150 years ago by one single fisherman, and the mythology or the story goes that the fisherman accidentally allowed this water into his ponds, and thinking that the water was going to destroy his fish ponds, he actually noticed that it increased the volume by which the fish ate and which they got larger, and he thought this was a great idea, and then other fishermen started to follow suit. And so now, from one fisherman about 120 years ago, we have 300 fish pond farming systems, and they clean half of the city's water. So that's sewage from about 7 million people every single day. And at the same time as cleaning the water, they also produce about 20% of the city's food. And so this system actually sits on the edges of the city of Calcutta, and the edges of the city of Calcutta are just this domain of absolute expansion, and often expansion that is branded as eco-village or eco-city. And the system is right next to the city's smoking escarpment of trash, and it's ribboned by highways, and as you can see in the background, all this development that is growing around it. And what's really interesting about the scale of this system, as I said, it started with one farmer's fish pond being contaminated in a really great way, and then it's expanded. And what the expansion has actually seen is that the city's population has grown 400% in the last 40 years, and that expansion of the system has happened alongside the city's growth. So this is a really interesting example of adaptability of a city that maintains an infrastructure that maintains a really an essential act for the city that is couched within the sort of the city environment. And what's sort of the dilemma of this particular technology is that it's being developed. So the land is now being sold. It is occupied by fishermen who've lived there for about 4 generations, but the government is now selling the land off to build new developments, new eco-cities. And so we find that this system is actually threatened. And this is an innovation that is a model for chemical and coal power-free purification that provides over 100,000 jobs for residents in the city. And Calcutta's core has no formal treatment system. So this is the only way to clean the water before it enters the Bay of Bengal downstream. And so sort of switching to another sort of essential part of what the book is trying to do, it's looking at these technologies from around the world. It's really asking, is there a new parable for how we can think about green technologies? But it's really also asking for us to think about how we can extend the conversations that we're having in the field. And, as designers, our work is really about conversations. It's even, as an academic, as a researcher, as a practitioner, in all ways, it's about conversations both with the past and with the present, with other allied disciplines and with designers within our own field as well. And we speak to each other about, and we speak to the past and the present. And Rudovsky's work, Architecture Without Architects, it was an exhibition in the 1960s at MoMA. And it really was at the very beginning of this research. It was, a seed that inspired the writing of the book and the research for the book. But the book is really about and this call for a new type of mythology of technology, it needs us, and it's asking for us to have broader conversation. It needs us to have really far broader conversations and bring people beyond our discipline and beyond our allied fields and beyond the traditional sciences into this conversation. It needs to involve traditional knowledge holders like Grima, and traditional knowledge holders are those people who have been passed down this traditional ecological knowledge that has been ignored by Western sciences and by the conservation movement. And LoTEK is really calling for us to acknowledge that these conversations need to be had and to begin those conversations and the sharing of this knowledge. And so, you know, the information in this book was really given permission to be published by communities like the Zune and Grima, who's the director of the Ashiwawan Museum and Heritage Center. And the book also features a series of interviews with Indigenous experts, and one of them is Jassim Al-Assadi, who's a good friend of mine. He's a Madan who was born in the marshes of southern Iraq, where they build an amazing island and cathedral-like housing technology out of a single species of reed called the Kasab. Jassim is an engineer, he's a scientist, he leads an organization called Nature Iraq, and their mission is to restore the marshes and the Madan culture. And I interviewed Jassim for the book, and the interviews were always done in indigenous language first, and then translated after we'd received the interviews into English, and also published in indigenous language and dialect in the book first, followed by the English version. I initially met Jassim because I worked on a wastewater treatment wetland park in the southern marshes of Iraq with him in 2013. And so he became somebody who was a really prominent contributor to the book as well. And here is the version of the English interview. And so LoTEK suggests that our nature-based technologies to climate change, they don't need to be passive conservation areas like protected wetlands, which is the really dominant conversation that's being had in opposition to high-tech, that climate change solutions are protected wetlands and protected forests. And that's why I mentioned previously, you know, the conservation movement adaptation of already protected areas to rebrand them to become our climate change solutions. And within that, we see that there's all the funding that's going to climate change solutions now being directed to areas that are conserved, when these types of technologies really aren't acknowledged by any of the dominant literature, like the IPCC report on the ocean of the cryosphere. And that is something that this work is really directed towards changing. And though these technologies that we think of as climate change solutions, they can be incredibly active and adaptive and productive and really complex coexistences of human and non-human species that use biodiversity as a building block. And one example is this Caviar aquaculture system of the Tufinu in Benin of West Africa. And just to mention, this is a beautiful image from Iwamban. And then, you know, this is a system that's actually known as the Venice of Africa. It's an aquatic city that's surrounded by 12,000 constructed fish pens that form this artificial reef system that's really ideal for capturing one particular type of very tasty fish, the tilapia, the black chin tilapia. And so this particular community who became aquatic from originally being terrestrial grazers 400 years ago, when they were at war with a neighboring tribe. They literally ran off and moved into the water. They migrated their terrestrial grazing technology to form aquatic grazing technology of these artificial reef and fish pens. And they've worked out how to create this system that, you know, attracts one single fish, which is incredible because there's a great biodiversity of different types of fish species in this particular environment. And what they've managed to do is, by a very straightforward technology of fish pens surrounded by nets with a particular gauge of net that allows small fish fry to travel into these fish pens. They stay inside because there's so much good stuff to eat, and then they grow fat and they can't swim back out, and so they can be hand fished. This system increases the biodiversity of all the other systems around it and the overall biodiversity of the lake, as well as feeding 1 million residents that live around this particular lake. And the system actually covers 2/3 of the surface of the lake. So LoTEK is a movement that seeds creativity in crisis, and it's inspired by technologies that are born from climate extremes, and it is intended to rebuild our understanding of sustainable, resilient systems, or at least open our eyes up to the possibility that there is a far greater amount of technologies that are available and that are out there in the world that use this idea of symbiosis and complex coexistences that are nature-based technologies. And it really calls for a re-exploration of these local technologies and vernacular design to rethink how we're thinking about climate resilience. And as designers, I really believe that our role is to create these new grounds for positive engagement with nature in support of these new nature-based technologies and in support of a new mythology of these technologies. Because we really seem to be drowning in this age of information while we're starving for wisdom. And we all know that we can't go backwards and we can't go and fix all those problems that cause climate change and all the extractive activities that have exacerbated the climate change that we're experiencing now and that we know we're going to experience into the future. But we can go forward and we can rethink and we can rebuild in a way that really supports the resilience of communities and cities. But at the same time, we can think about addressing the inequalities and distance from nature that our current systems support. And we need a new mythology to guide us in doing this, and one that isn't grounded in superiority or savior complex, nor informed only by European American ideologies. We perhaps need one that is informed by thousands of years of cultural knowledge from communities who've successfully been living and surviving with nature. And climate change is showing us that shifting our thinking from this concept of survival of the fittest to survival of the most symbiotic is a really critical first step. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was great. To anyone that's joining us in the live stream of this talk, I would just like to say that you can add questions in the question and answer tab or raise your hand, and we can get to them in this conversation. I would also like to open it up to the residents here that are part of Non-Extractive Architecture, which is an exhibition ongoing at V-A-C Zattere, curated by Space Caviar, and also the audience members that are here joining us here. So we can start with any questions that you guys have. Great.
Hey, Julia. Thank you. Thank you for the talk. You spoke of these. You spoke of these different practices emerging in a particular context, a particular community, in a particular environment. I'm curious if one were to sort of take this book as a sort of guidebook of practices to be replicated. Like, what does it mean when these practices enter into different communities and different environments than the ones that they were born in?
Yeah, I'll answer that by talking about this something that I found in doing the research for the book called Simultaneous Innovation. So I found initially, say for example, the East Calcutta wetlands, which was that wastewater treatment system in the city of Calcutta, which is cleaning the city's water, producing the city's food. And I got really interested in this idea that you could, very naturally use a nature-based technology and in place of a sewage treatment plant. I also found another technology that was in China, which was for silkworm rearing, textile producing, and aquaculture that also cleans sewage. And then most recently, I found another technology in Indonesia. That is an intertidal aquaculture technology that also is a wastewater cleaning technology. And so this idea that, a specific technology is born of a particular community, is born of a particular environment, but that there are also sort of generalized principles and ways that these technologies work that individual communities have evolved over time without any communication. That became really interesting. And that's kind of like one of the main ideas that the book also talks about, is these typologies of different technologies. And so these technologies, while they're slightly different, they're doing sort of the same performance. So each of these three technologies are performing to clean wastewater while producing food. And so these technologies could definitely be, and I talk about this in the book, that they could be understood as a migration that could be taken to a different location, but a similar biome, a similar wetland environment. And there would have to be sort of local understandings and local knowledge and local management systems, like was shown in that complex, the pyramid complex of traditional ecological knowledge, that would need to be put in place to support those types of systems. But that would be allowed, and it's actually already happening, especially with pyrotechnology and the use of cultural burning across the world. So there are large knowledge sharing communities now being established, especially after the Black Summer in Australia last year, where Indigenous communities are starting to share knowledge and share these systems with other communities to assist in preventative burning to deter wildfires just decimating ecosystems. And I think that sort of begins to talk about how these systems can be reapplied and the potential for these different systems. But that site specificity and that place-based knowledge is always and is an essential part of traditional ecological knowledge in these systems, and is an essential part of the reformulation of a system in a new environment.
Thanks, Julia. Could I just ask you to press stop share on the top of your screen?
Sure. Yes.
That's a little bit better. Now we can see you full on. Yeah. There's a question in the chat. Can you pull up the chat? I can just read. Okay, it's from Ivan Nieto. When facing extremely strong climate calamities, specifically hurricanes with high-speed hurricanes and floods, the most resistant material appears to be reinforced concrete because of its monolithic character. Have you experienced in your research a low-tech and environmentally friendlier solution for this scenario?
Yeah, often there is, I mean, it depends, what sort of a system you're defending. But there are systems that do use a fortification. So you would call a concrete barrier a fortification system. And there are systems that do have fortification systems, like fish ponds that are made out of coral rock that are then held in place over time by oysters that create a concrete mortar that keeps these walls in place. And actually we've got examples of 500-year-old walls that are built from this type of technology. But usually these technologies in a nature-based technology don't exist alone. So there'll be some sort of a barrier system out at sea that'll be followed by some sort of a pool system that'll allow for inundation that will actually capture some of the wave energy. Then there'll be a mangrove system that will stop that wave energy moving inland. Then there'll be a terrace system that will allow for different types of flooding as you move up, and then there'll be, it creates what we call like a multi-ecosystem approach to these types of technologies and how they're placed within a gradient of, say, aquatic to terrestrial. And so the thinking is more complex, and that's what I talk about, is this, stop to sort of really question this universal homogenized response, and to think about a far more diverse and multi-ecosystem approach to dealing with these types of forces and these types of systems. And it's not only that that approach of what to do on impact and when the storm is occurring. There's also ways to fortify housing systems so that they're not affected, so roofs don't fly off, so that housing and buildings are not leveled, to secure vegetation and to secure agriculture so that it's not completely decimated, and therefore you get months worth of food insecurity post these storm events. There is this sort of way that a preventative approach is thought of on a large time scale as a multi-scalar ecosystem approach, both at the site of the event, but also beyond in understanding all the networks that support the community that could be disrupted post-event as well.
Great. Anyone else in the room? Questions? Or in the chat? Is that another question, or is it the one we already answered? Oh, no, here's another one. From Heidi Jackie. Do you have any recommendations to approach the work with Indigenous communities, specifically how to avoid falling into the superiority savior complexes you mentioned?
I mean, the way I've approached it is always it's usually by invitation for me, but it's always, this happens over a process that happens over time. It's identifying the people that are the knowledge holders that are able to share knowledge. That's always something that needs to be found and understood, that there are ways that you can ask knowledge to be shared, and there's ways that you can sort of go about the process of gathering knowledge and starting to think about its integration. But it's really this idea that that this knowledge is that's in the book is we need to apply it in New York City, or in a environment that's a city. That's not really the direct idea of the book. The idea is sort of really a questioning about the way we think of technology in the built environment, and more broadly, it's become a provocation for the way we think about technology in general. And that that this idea of knowledge sharing, of intellectual property, of how Indigenous communities and how Indigenous leaders are actually brought into this conversation, and to really push that idea forward. That's really what the book is about, to sort of bring this to light and to start that process of allowing and to sort of push forward the idea that this is the essential knowledge that we need to bring into the conversation now, that's being left out at all scales, at government scales, at local scales, at the scales of how we work on large-scale regional projects. And the process by which it can occur is really sort of initially the invitation, because Indigenous communities aren't really being brought into those conversations at this moment.
Thank you so much. If there's no other questions, I would just like to say thank you for joining us and being part of this ongoing project that we also hope will become an archive, and examples like your book really inspired us, this sort of ongoing handbook of really challenging the way we think of architecture as a technology, but also even the role of the architect, and opening that up to members of communities like the ones you mentioned. So I'd just like to say thank you, and I wish that you could be here in Venice, but for now we have your book in our library. So if you come by in Venice, if people are watching and you're here in Venice, you can come by and check it out and see how it's also part of this exhibition. And we hope that eventually, Julia, you can also come here and join us in person. But for now, this was a good plan B, I think. So thank you again for being part of it.
Thank you so much. Hopefully I'll be in Venice later this year.
Yeah, that would be great to see you.
All right.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.